Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session 2 of the Tenant Training 101 series. My name is Lisa Waddell. I'm the housing specialist from MDH Maryland, MFP program. And today I will be moderating this session. Today's topic will be the leasing up process, tenant training manual, community rules, and some legal resources will be given to you guys. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat or the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer all questions at the end of each presenter's presentation. Also, this full presentation will be uploaded to MDOD YouTube channel. And you all will be provided with copies of the PowerPoint at the end of the session via an email. Now, I will talk to you about our two presenters today, Penny Scrivens and Marianne Graham. Penny Scrivens is a licensed clinical social worker. She works as a housing and resource consultant for MDOD, and she has been with the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing before the state of Maryland actually received its very first HUD 811 award. Penny provides both in-person and virtual tenant trainings to new tenants, their families, and case managers. In general, tenant training assists new residents in reviewing and understanding their lease, community rules, rights, and privileges. The ultimate goal of tenant training is to have our participants maintain tenancy as long as possible. Penny will go over the tenant training manual and part of the leasing up process. After Penny, we have Marianne Graham, who is also a licensed clinical social worker and the Housing and Compliance Director of Money Follows the Person Demonstration Project at the Maryland Department of Health. Marianne has extensive case management experience and currently provides tenant training for our housing and community-based services program participants who become tenants through MPAR housing programs. So first up, we have Penny.
Okay, are you gonna move, who's moving the slides for me? Marianne?
Yes, I'm moving. Are you ready
Okay.
for the next one?
Okay, yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm glad you were able to join us today. I will, we were talking earlier about some of our material being a little duplicated, and you might hear things that if you attended last Thursday, you may hear some of that again today. We're doing our best to kind of weed some of that out, but sometimes it is good to kind of hear it for the second or third time. But we're trying to make sure that everybody is kind of on the same page with the material, especially if you're hearing it for the very first time. So we apologize if you've heard it a couple more times and want to move on to something else, but we appreciate your attendance at all of our trainings, whether they repeat themselves or not. This is the first polling question. Do you have a copy of my own front door handbook?
I'm launching the poll now. Please just
Okay.
answer the first two questions for now.
Okay.
And hopefully it allows you to submit your answers. If it does not, just use the chat to provide a response. Looks like Sarah says yes to both 1 and 2. Brittany Purcell says no to both. Amina says not yet.
Mm-hmm.
No to both. Michelle. Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Lauren says yes to both 1 and 2. Looks like we have a bunch of people who do not use the resource.
Do not have it.
Yeah.
I also find that when I go and I'm in person with the tenant and their case manager, lots of times they've either heard of it, but have never seen a copy of it, or they've never heard of it and certainly welcome the information that's in the handbook, which of course we go over, not in detail because we'd be spending a longer period of time doing that. But it does have a lot of highlights in it that really are very important to go over. You may not need some of those resources right off the bat because you're involved in something else when you move in, but later on, sometimes that information, especially the resources, come in handy. So I tell people to kind of make sure that they keep them in a good place so they can go back and retrieve it. Okay, next one. This is the front copy of it. This was designed to assist persons with disabilities or families, case managers, to not only support a person during their housing search, but also assist in the process, getting their documents together. And what are those things? A lot of the beginning of the booklet has to do with planning, thinking through your decisions about where you want to live, what you're going to need to live independently, identifying some of your preferences, things that you might need if you're living by yourself, your readiness to do this. Do you know what it's going to take to be able to do the budgeting and relying upon yourself to do certain things that you maybe took for granted, or, we just are in places sometimes where things are done for us. And when you're moving in and you're on your own, that's going to change. Okay. And we try to make sure that we go through not only the planning and the thinking through the plan, but also, when you've moved in, the other thing is how to maintain that tenancy, and then also leaving the unit as well, because we'd like to make sure that there's a beginning and an end. Hopefully the end is way down the road, because when you move in, lots of times people really like the unit and they don't plan to do any moving, but there is a process. So I just want to make you aware of that. Next slide. How many times have you moved? Oh, these are polling questions. I'm sorry.
So
Yeah.
we're just going to use the chat for the polling questions because of how they were entered in. So please respond to these 2 questions using the chat. And we can moderate, just kind of go through the responses there. Looks like someone's saying that they've done this over 20 times, more times than they can count.
Oh, 15.
Over
4.
15.
Yeah. And I know it's hard to respond on this kind of forum here, but the thing that I hear a lot is, it's a daunting process to move yourself from one location, and even to think about moving when you were living at home. Sometimes people move out after they get that first job or job offer, and it's not in the place that you're currently living. So you not only are starting a new job, but you're moving at the same time. And it's the same for many of our clients that become tenants for the very first time. Sometimes people have commented to me in the tenant training that they didn't realize there were so many things to take care of, and keeping it all together has been really a challenge. Okay, next slide. The handbook has a lot of tools, and it helps persons with disabilities through the whole process. I'm certain, it doesn't answer every question. Our clients are very unique sometimes in some of the needs that they have. Because I just recently did several tenant trainings, and each person that I met had different issues to bring up, or ask me questions that wasn't something that the person before them or that I had seen earlier in the week was asking something completely different. So readiness for for housing has to do with those conversations that the case manager has before they actually maybe even put their name on the referral list to be considered for a unit through HUD 811. And then that process of, are you ready to budget? And how are you budgeting now? How are you doing that to save up money for security deposits or utility turn-ons? You know, and just getting your house basically equipped with just some of the basic things. So sometimes talking or thinking through that and actually talking about how they're going to accomplish some of those things are really necessary. It also reduces the stress level for that person moving in for the very first time, that they've gotten some things taken care of before they move in, or they know how they're going to handle something if something goes awry. What if they can't access transportation right away? We've had that happen with people that are living in a new area and they don't have family, friends, or even their case manager right off the bat to be able to take them places that they may need to go and get their address changed with DSS. You know, purchase things and get them back to the unit. So discussing those things before and after they move in is really part of that process. If you're the case manager, in addition to doing the tenant training, sometimes they're two separate people. And if not, then, you know, you've done some of this already if you've been the case manager that did the referral. But if you're like myself, I may just go and see the person that one time. We pretty much stick to the handbook, okay? But I do try to involve, whenever we can, the case manager or even family members actually that may be helping that person out. Go ahead, keep going. Housing preferences, a lot of that's taken care of by the time you're doing the tenant training with the person, but some of these things are preferences and needs for that particular person, and just making sure that they have those accommodations either gotten started, taken care of already, or they need to apply for those things. Realizing that, you know, there wasn't grab bars in the bathroom, or, you know, the lights are too high, or the door is not wide enough to be able to get a wheelchair through. And we're talking mainly about folks that have, you know, that they need other equipment in the apartment to be able to function independently. Okay. You've already probably gone through this many times with a lot of the folks that do get referred to this program, but we do keep a list. It's really a good idea to have that because it kind of keeps the tenant organized as well as yourself if you're working with that person. But I go through the list just to make sure they know that they need to keep tabs on all these things. Sometimes what we have are people that have an expired ID when they go back in for their recertification in a year. So they need to keep an eye on those kind of things, or make a note to themselves, you know, it's going to expire in October and I'm going to have to do a new recertification in, you know, in January or whatever. And just talking about that actually makes them aware that that's something that's going to come up during their time there the first year. But making sure that they're keeping them in I remind them to make sure they keep them in a safe place, that they can easily get them, have easy access to them. But sometimes they're still getting some of that paperwork together, even when they're getting ready to move in. I know Christine's on the line, but you know, sometimes these are the things that delay people from doing that first lease up. You know, they're waiting 30 days for a birth certificate to come
Did you
back.
want me to jump on my soapbox, Penny?
Oh, you certainly can.
No, I could take up the whole 2 hours.
Yeah,
But Penny is right. So I'll just give my real quick blurb.
no, just to say that again, these sometimes are the delays, even in taking somebody that's next on the list, because it's going to be 60 days before
Yes.
that person's going to be able to get to the point where they're leasing up. So, and that delay is going to possibly, delay it so much they're not going to be able to move into that unit in a timely way. Because
And-
remember too, the developer and then the property manager, I mean, their main goal is to get those units leased up, to get people moved in. And of course, it's ours too, but the motivation's a little different because they're losing income for an empty unit. So, and that's part of it too. I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, Christina, but I thought I'd mention that. That's the other side of the dilemma here, but.
No, I appreciate you mentioning everything about that because it's on both sides. So, the sooner your clients have all of that documentation ready to go and available for a lease up, that's great.
Mhm.
It just makes it helpful. But like Penny said, not having some of those things can delay the process and potentially, keep your client from even being considered for that housing opportunity if they don't have it. And then I'm just going to add a third layer to it of, delays at the property because of supply chain issues, which, we're seeing everywhere, and then
Mhm.
having to recollect certain pieces of documentation because they have expired. And I feel
Yep.
like if I didn't look and see who all was on the call, but I'm sure a couple support planners and case managers would be familiar with this situation with the pandemic of having delays with the property, the units not
Mhm.
being ready or things like that. And then an award letter from Social Security, has to be 90 days old. So now it's, 91 days and you have to get a new letter. And so, we appreciate all of your help in, recollecting, the documents. And I'm sure that it's, something that clients aren't always willing to understand. We just got that award letter. How can it be old? Well, it's old. And there's a whole
Mhm.
compliance department at a property that will tell
Right.
you that it's old. And in order to move forward, you need something new. So there's a couple different things going on here when it comes to documentation, but I would always tell you that having, making sure that they have some of these things, the sooner the better, because they're going to need them for where, and it's not even just for this program. If they were applying for, a housing choice voucher with a housing authority, they're going to need all of these documentations. If they're going to get a roommate and, share rent, they're going to need all of these documentations. So this isn't just program specific. This is housing specific.
Mhm. Right. And I think what I emphasize when I do tenant training is it's not just for now. I mean, you're in your unit, you've signed your lease. Obviously, you did have all or most of your paperwork available, but it's ongoing. It's, because sometimes you don't know when you're going to need your social security card or even a valid Maryland ID. I mean, you need that just to have with you, but you might need to have a copy of it for something that's happening, during that first year. And, running around trying to find it sometimes just takes too long, and it's very frustrating. So I really encourage people to make sure they keep a folder. I went to see somebody yesterday and they definitely had their folder together. They had everything in there, and they had an itemized manila folder actually breaking, their license down and, their birth certificate, social security card. So she knew exactly where to go if she needed any of those things. Sorry, we dwelled on that, but it certainly is an important piece. And I know it delays lots of different things for people. Okay, next slide. I'm sorry.
Before we move to the next slide, there was a question in the chat.
Okay.
Etta was asking, isn't there a way to get the birth certificate and social security card via medical documentation such as a face sheet and government mail.
You mean remotely? I mean, you can get the birth certificate. Guess I'm not seeing the question. Do you want to answer it, Mary Ann, or?
Etta, do you want to, well, I guess you probably can't unmute, to clarify what you meant by your question? I'm wondering if you're asking if you can use medical, like if someone's in the hospital, like documentation, either from, a medical or the nursing facility, in order to obtain the birth certificate and social security card. Is that what you were talking about? Like alternate forms? Okay, yeah.
Okay,
So I know there are some alternate forms of documentation, and you usually have to go to that specific website to find out. Like for motor vehicle administration, there's a list on their website of alternate documentation that you can use, and probably the same for Social Security. But it's been a little while since I had to obtain anything for people in that way. Penny, do you have any specific knowledge?
no, I mean,
related to that?
I know it changes frequently. I mean, that's what I hear back from clients, like one time they can go and get what they need from the Social Security office, but I think she's talking about verifying a disability. Is that correct?
I think she's actually talking, and correct me in the chat if I'm wrong, Etta. I think she's talking about, the difficulty, because oftentimes in order to get a state ID, you need your birth certificate. But if you don't have your
Right.
birth certificate, or you need your birth certificate and a state ID in order to get your social security card. And so I think she's talking about what if someone is starting from a base of not having any of those things,
Mhm.
how do you start? And I think the first thing is to, go to those websites or contact those offices to find out what the alternative
Mhm.
documents they will accept.
Yeah,
So I
so-
know, because I just recently had to look up on motor vehicle, that they have a list of alternate documents that you can use. And so, one thing was mail, like a piece of mail from a government agency.
Right.
So probably like if your client received Social Security award letter or notification, they get that once a year in January, I believe. They get that letter that says what their award is going to be for the rest of the year. I think you can use things like that, but like Penny said, it does change.
Does change, yeah.
And also, with a birth certificate, if someone is in a nursing facility, they can just get a medical statement from the nursing facility stating that they are there, and they can forward that along with a letter from the social worker or case manager, support planner, stating that they're trying to access a birth certificate for someone and submit it, and then they will get that birth certificate back. It may take a while because it has to be processed, but you can do alternate documentation to get your birth certificate and social security card. But like
Okay.
Marianne said, just go to the website.
When these are listed in the handbook, and also, we have these lists, I mean, it's good to just download this maybe as a separate piece so that you can kind of if you're continuing to work with that person, you can kind of do inventory maybe every 6 months or something like that, just so they have, the current information. But these are all great questions, so thank you for bringing that up. Again, as part of the planning, I mean, usually what I ask with the, when I go and do the tenant training, I ask whether they have developed a budget, knowing where their money is coming in from, what sources, and we give kind of a pretty extensive list, but there's always those odd things that kind of come up as far as, income for the month that you need to make sure that they've listed and reported. So you get a total of that. Just keep going. Yeah. And then added to that, you're creating a living budget, meaning that you're going to have move-in costs that don't duplicate for the next, year. I mean, these are maybe upfront kind of costs, like getting furniture, which you're not going to be buying every month. Or like I pointed out, you're not going to buy a trash can every month, but you might need some extra money to purchase some of these things in the first couple months. And people sometimes I found that, they've saved up, they've been planning for it, they put it aside so they could get a bed and other essentials, for their kitchen. One of the other websites that I put down here when I was developing these slides is I do training actually in other venues with the Community Financial Protection Bureau. I actually was introduced to it with MDOD's program. We got pamphlets. They're available for you at that website. If you're working with a group of people that aren't quite sure how to put together a budget, how to maintain one, what to do about bad credit, how to get things off the credit report that aren't true or don't even apply to you. There are lots of things other than just what I just mentioned that are located in these booklets. And I think I have a picture of them, but these are just some things that moving in expenses, you get an idea. I ask whether they had any help moving in. Sometimes the case managers share that with me. So I kind of know what they've been able to do on their own. These are some of the pages from the booklets. They're very readable. They're very clear. They don't go through a lot of, definitions or words that may not be commonplace. Are you going to get a copy of the presentation? Okay. Yes. Isn't that correct, Chelsea? They're getting a copy of the presentation. That was a question.
Yes.
Okay. So you are welcome to check that website. These are free. They have booklets that are geared as to our particular population with persons with disabilities. And this is across disabilities, not necessarily behavioral health, but also with physical disabilities, kind of those visible and invisible disabilities that we all know about. But it gives you some direction. It helps the person kind of process. Yeah, I do need to get a budget. How's that really going to help me? I pay the bills when they come in, but then when I run out of money, I don't know what to do. It even goes through information about how to handle things like that. Not to completely ignore bills that come in every other month with statements that say that you are in the arrears, especially around medical expenses, which credit reporting bureaus now are kind of dealing with a little bit differently. I don't think they're putting them on there anymore. I don't know if anybody's got an update about that, but that was something that really stood out in a credit report when they had $5,000 or $10,000 or even more of medical bills that were still lingering on their credit report, and they're not going to be reported that way. And bring the person's score down.
Hey, Penny, real quick.
Yeah.
You're kind of fading in and out. Could you sit a little bit closer to your computer just so that way we can hear you?
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
So anyway, we can go on, but these are some of the booklets. I use them. If I have them in my car when I'm putting together the other materials, I bring them in with me as an aid for them to kind of take a look at. This is again about your money, your goals. It gives you online resources as well. They from time to time, the Bureau actually provides workshops that are about an hour and 15 minutes long. I know many of us have attended them over the past, I guess, almost 6 or 7 years now. And we kind of make them a part of that, information that we turn over to case managers, because sometimes an agency like this can explain and offer materials that we might not have right in our agency. And this really is a very geared up presentation, not just for the case managers or even family members working with a person that may have a disability, but also to have that person use these materials. They're very usable charts. So I just thought I'd let you know about that. We don't have to do everything. We don't have to be all for the client. They can use other resources that we've found out about. Next slide. Okay. This is a question that always comes up. We've explained it differently, or we go back to the tried and true of tenants paying 30% of their income toward the rent, which includes the utility allowance stated in the lease. Sometimes we've had clients, when I'm doing a tenant training, and Christina can chime in as well, or Chelsea, but the 30% does not mean that the utility allowance is paid for by the property management or even Department of Housing and Community Development. Part of the allowance that comes together to make that 30% of their income includes rent, and whatever the estimated utility bill, it could be $50 or $70, but it doesn't go over that 30%, okay? But they do get a bill in the mail. The utilities need to be turned on and billed in the tenant's name, okay? And the rest of that person's rent is paid for through the HUD funding. And it's administered by DHCD. Okay. I think we have a slide of the way it might break down. This is just an example. Grace monthly income is $783. 30% of her income is $235. With the utility allowance, it's just an estimate, $75 a month. So the monthly rent minus, the 30% minus the utility allowance, her monthly rent is $160. So that's what goes to the property management. And then when her bill comes in, and it could be more than 75 or could be less, but she just pays, or he just pays the utility bill at what the cost is for that particular month. One of the things that we definitely go over when we're talking to our new tenants about knowing how to use all of their appliances, and certainly the thermostat, they may not be used to those kind of fancier thermostats, but to know how to use all of the appliances, and certainly how to regulate the thermostat, so they're not paying double what that allowance would be. Okay. This is the first time some of our tenants have heard about a turn-on fee. Sometimes that's budgeted with the gas and electric company that they're working with over 6 months. Sometimes they use a budget plan like that because they know that the person does not have $300 to initially get that turned on. That can be worked out as well. Or sometimes it's for a person that I worked with yesterday, they only had to pay $50 because their credit score was pretty good. So I think this is one of those slides where we need to make sure that when I've gone in person, I go through the unit with the person to just make sure they have plates over all the electrical outlets, that the fan and the light work over the stove, how to handle the dishwasher. We recommend that they at least run it through the rinse cycle at least once a month if they don't use it frequently. Sometimes people say, I just take care of my dishes as I use them. But the hoses definitely need to have the, you know, the water going through them. It's not a good idea to just completely ignore, you know, running it. Because I think, you know, the hoses can crack over time. And just to know how to use all the appliances in the unit, so that if you've never used it and they turn it on and it's broken, you know, when does that start and stop with the tenant maybe not reporting a breakage, or if it's never been used before. We could go on from here. Okay. I think this goes back to making the decision. Persons, in our case, you know, the tenants are already moved in by the time they're getting tenant training, but these are some of the things to write down or keep track of, actually. In the under the suspect housing discrimination, we revised a list for you, and that's on slide 17. About agencies that do assist, or at least can be called to consult about a particular issue. So I would keep that list handy. I usually Google. I don't know if we have the actual websites to all of them. Do we, Chelsea, or no?
I think that we have some of them. I don't know that we have all of them, but it's on a later slide. It's on a later slide.
But I think we can Google them as well, you know, because I've done that before. But certainly utilize these agencies. Sometimes when we're thinking about it, or trying to think it through with the client, especially when you get that question during tenant training, it's always good to go back to the experts to find out what the rights and privileges are of that particular tenant in that situation. Okay. Next slide. Reasonable accommodations. Again, I'm just going to read from this, but it's persons with disabilities have a right to reasonable accommodations to request that the property owners change certain rules, policies, physical characteristics of the unit. But in most cases, the owners or the developer or the property manager, they're willing to work with the tenant unless it's too expensive or an extreme burden for the owner. And then decisions, of course, can be appealed. And I think we're, you know, very good at kind of looking at all of these requests. Are we brought into some of those decisions as well? I think we are, right, Chelsea? For reasonable accommodations, sometimes I think the property management actually consults with us.
Yeah, yes, it depends, Penny, because there are some reasonable accommodations that simply need to be directed to the property. There's not any need for us to be a part of that process, particularly if it's something like you know, somebody needs a copy of their lease in a different format, for instance. There's no need to involve MDOD in those conversations unless there's some issue in which the property is refusing to grant an accommodation or grant a modification. So please, please contact the property manager first. If you're having issues, you're welcome to pull us in and we're happy to help.
Right, and I purposely put this slide in our lease, not just because we need to know about reasonable accommodations, but I think, like Chelsea's saying, really go back to the actual source, and that definitely is the property management, because they're the person that you're going to see. That's the person that the tenant's going to see, and also to work through a schedule if they need to come in and make some repairs or changes to it. It's really, we're kind of a third extra wheel sometimes in something that can be dealt with right there at the property, okay? And getting the tenant involved in that process is really a very good way for them to feel like they have that rapport or relationship that they can go to the property management, do what they need to do, fill out a form, whatever, and be able to work through whatever scheduling they need to do to get something fixed or changed or at least looked at, okay? Next slide.
Are you wanting to skip over this slide, Penny?
Well, I think
Because we're gonna-
I
we're gonna
really
talk about
addressed
it.
a lot of things there already, you know, just knowing how to handle all the you know, the questions about their lease, where to pay,
Yeah,
their
we're gonna
rent.
talk about
Yeah.
about that in the next set of slides too.
Right,
Okay.
but sometimes just kind of, you know, digging through those details sometimes are very helpful. Reduces stress with the, not just the case manager, but definitely with the tenants so that they know what to do. So that's really the aim of that slide. This polling question, tenant does not have to pay their rent if hospitalized or in rehab for 30 days or more. Is that true or false? I think most everybody's saying false. You know, they have to continue to pay the rent and utilities. Since the tenant is away for more than 30 days, subletting to a friend is allowed as a special situation. And that's false as well. They cannot do that. The person is not on the lease. They may want to help out a friend, but this is not the way to do it because they jeopardize their tenancy. And we do have a form that is available, I think, through MDOD, but I usually present the form when I go for the tenant training that allows an addendum that if the person is out for more than 180 days, they do not lose their unit, okay? This is about the lease, and like Mary Ann and Lisa have said, they're going to be going over that more extensively. And I think the last part of this is, you know, the guide for resources. If you, as the person doing the tenant training, or you're also the case manager, certainly giving that person the network of resources that are in that community, transportation, shopping, even where the local clinic is, if they have a, you know, they cut themselves and need stitches or anything like that. And then the last section, of course, is about the recertification process so that they know that, you know, that's something that's going to happen on a yearly basis. We also encourage the renter's insurance and acknowledging with them that they know when things are due, like their rent and their utility and maybe even their phone bill, if they're aware of those dates. Okay. I think we're close to the end here. Yep. And I think, just like I encouraged earlier, the more the tenant engages with the property manager, you know, there is that communication, because I think, like Chelsea said, there's sometimes that we don't need to be brought into another piece to that person's tenancy. It really needs to be something that's handled with the property manager and the tenant, and having that discussion, or even finding out when things are going to happen, where they're happening. Okay, because you have to wait for us sometimes to get back to you. It really can happen right from the very beginning with the lease up. Okay, and I think that's the end of my talking. Are there any questions that you want us to handle right now, or
Can I interject something, Penny, real
Yeah.
quick before you
Yeah.
take questions?
If you need to clarify anything, yeah.
No, not clarifying anything. I just kind of want to give a little plug because Mary Ann and Chelsea and Lisa and I have been discussing this, and Penny, you were on the call the other day when we were talking about the tenant issue process and things like that. And kind of just a reminder that, we do have this tenant issue process in place for the property managers to, first speak with the tenant, if things aren't going in a responsive way, go to the
Mhm.
case manager, support planner, things like that. But on the other side of that coin, we want to make sure that case managers and support planners understand that we can't control property management companies. We don't have any oversight over them. So, yes, we are here to, solidify that relationship that everybody has and keep it a working relationship that's good. Just be aware that, if your client comes to you and says, there's, a pest control issue, case managers, they don't have to come to me or Mary Ann or Chelsea or Lisa, or call Penny for that matter. Contact the property. I mean, the property does pest control. They have all of that set up. If your client needs another pest control appointment, they will gladly set those things up. If they're, asking for an update on things, that's going to come from the property manager. We, as a, Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing, we don't have anything to do with reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications, when it comes to someone's apartment. So we're going to try to make sure that we reiterate that in some future trainings and give you, information on that. But since, like Penny, I heard you talking about it and it kind of made a light bulb go off since we just had that conversation a couple of days ago, that I just want to make sure that everybody understands that process, that, there are times that we don't mind helping, but just to let you guys know that, case managers can step in and provide that guidance, with the property managers and maintenance and things like that.
Thanks, Christina. That's a good way to transition into our tenants' rights and responsibilities and talking a little bit more in depth about the lease.
Sorry,
I should have waited till after yours, Mary Ann. I'll come back on at the end and say it again.
Thanks for moving the slides. I appreciate that.
No problem, Penny. Glad to help. Repetition is the mother of learning, as they say in, I can't remember where I heard that before, but I think it's
a good one.
Yeah.
No, that's a really, I mean, I was thinking, here's Pete, and repeat. That's what came to my mind. But.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the lease and in a little bit more detail. And I will try to not be too redundant to what's been discussed previously, but we do have some overlapping information. But basically, the lease is a legally binding document between the tenant and the landlord. And it's really important that the tenant keep a copy of the lease because it defines their rights and responsibilities, lays out how much rent they're going to pay, what utilities they're responsible for. It may say what the utility allowance is, specifically for the programs that have utility allowance involved. And it also says what the landlord will and will not do and what their rights and responsibilities are. And so a lot of confusion can be, cleared up by referring back to the lease. And one of the things that we recommend during tenant training to case managers is that they get a copy of their tenant's lease, of their client's lease, so that they can have a copy of it. When I was doing case management, I always tried to get a copy of the lease because oftentimes my clients who were homeless previous to being leased up had difficulty sometimes maintaining those documents. And so an issue would come up, and then, I would be able to look at the lease, and it would help me to help them resolve the issue. So just something to think about. Again, the lease also lays out in what circumstances can it be terminated? Can it be broken? What is there a cost to that? And definitely, in the hustle bustle of doing the leasing up and moving in and all of that, it can get lost in the shuffle, but the tenant should definitely read the lease before signing it. Good properties are going to really go over each section of the lease as they require the person to initial or sign. And sometimes that is fast and it's overwhelming because it's a lot of information. So I recommend that tenants and case managers go over the lease again when things are a little bit calmer, maybe after the person has moved in, but they should be looking at it during the signing or even prior to the signing, if they're able. Okay, another poll. So we're gonna just again answer in the chat. We were just curious as to how old were you when you signed your first lease? Okay. A lot of people are putting their direct ages in, which thank you, I appreciate that. We have some people saying 19, 25, 21, that 18 to 25 span, 23. Yeah, so a lot of times people sign leases early, but you may be working with people who have never had their own lease, and so they may be older, and this may be the very first time that they are having a lease and having this responsibility. And so it's good to have that conversation with your client to find out, hey, what is your experience with this? Some people will be very experienced and some people will be brand new. And so you need to know that information so you can kind of tailor your information and resources for them. Okay. So the tenant should be given a copy of the lease at the lease signing, but we did a tenant training on Tuesday, and the gentleman had been in his apartment since March and still did not have a copy of the lease. So it's important that, as case managers, that you follow up with your tenant or your client regarding whether or not they received a copy of their lease. And again, like I was saying before, if you are able to ask, if hopefully you have that a good relationship with your client, that you can ask them for a copy of the lease and just explain what your reasoning is for that. And obviously, if they don't want to give you a copy of the lease, that's fine too, because that's their right. But it will be helpful to you and hopefully to them to deal with any issues that come up. Okay. So the other thing is making sure, and this really should happen at the lease up, but making sure that they have the correct lease, because again, the lease up, it can be a very stressful process, especially if it's something that people are not used to. There's a lot of information. They're usually going quickly and having people initial and sign and going over all of these rules and responsibilities. And so it's easy for things to get lost in the shuffle, but it's important to know. So, and the reason we say that is because in HUD 811, there's a specific lease which is separate from the property's lease. So, if the person is part of the HUD 811 program, you don't want them signing the property's lease. They need the HUD 811 lease because it supersedes the property's lease, and it's the lease that's enforceable. And as Penny mentioned previously, there is one of the most important things about the HUD 811 lease is it has the lease addendum, which allows a tenant to have up to 180 days or 6 months of absence if it's due to medical reasons, as long as they continue to pay their rent and utilities while they're out of the unit. Again, Penny mentioned this already, but the unit should be inspected prior to move-in. In these COVID times, it can be difficult. Sometimes not the lease up so much, although periodically, but the first interviews and things may be virtual or by phone. Or it may need to be requested by that. We tend to work with people who are in nursing facilities, so it can be very difficult for them to get out and about, to interview in person and to view units before they actually apply for them. So a reasonable accommodation request could definitely be that someone requests a virtual inspection or a virtual visit to check the unit out. Many properties have experience with that, so it's something that can definitely be asked for. When the person, if they're not able to, look at the apartment ahead of time, if they could, prior to them moving all their stuff in, if they can go in and check for their damages, any items that might need to be fixed or replaced. And again, as Penny mentioned previously, checking things like outlets, water pressure, the appliances, that everything is working properly. And usually the property will provide a checklist. So, and it's actually something that they may require the tenant to sign after, going in and checking the unit out. So if they don't provide that, I definitely would encourage you to encourage the tenant to ask about that. And it should say something in there specifically about how long they have to request repairs after the move-in. You don't want to wait, 6 months and something's been broken from the very beginning, because they could, hold the tenant liable for that when it's actually not their fault. It was something that happened before, but if it wasn't noted, Okay. Okay. So the lease is effective on the date that it's signed. And on the date that it's signed, the tenant should receive the keys and is considered in possession of the unit. And at that point, they should also know the amount of their rent and when it's due. And if their income has been reduced because they may have been in a nursing facility or some other institution where their money was going to that institution, it's going to take some time before their income is reinstated. So the important thing for you all to know and for you to convey during the tenant training is that, the tenant is responsible for informing the property once they start receiving their full income again. So, or if they receive any increases. So for increases, it's if they're $200 or more a month, that should be reported immediately. And obviously, if they're having a decrease in income, that should be reported immediately as well, because we don't want tenants to get into a situation where they didn't report that their income was reduced, but they're having trouble paying their rent because they have less income. That's the benefit of being in these type of programs, is that, they adjust based on the person's income. Okay. It's really important to talk with the tenant about, what is their plan for paying their rent. It's not as much of an issue now, but, if there's situations where the person has difficulty getting out and about, are they able to pay their rent online? is it going to be difficult for them to have to try to get a check or a money order, and to think about, oh, I'm going to have to mail that ahead of time because I don't want to be late. Is there anybody going to be in the office? One of the things that we've run into over this pandemic period is that in the beginning, many leasing offices were closed. And even now they may be open, but they have reduced hours, or they, don't have staff there every day. Maybe it's every other day, or Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So it can be difficult for people who are trying to pay in person to pay their rent on time. So all of those things need to be considered and taken into account. And then an important thing about HUD 811 that doesn't necessarily apply to other programs is that there are no late fees. There's no fees assessed for late rent payments. So of course, you want to encourage your client to pay their rent on time, because even though there's no late fees, some properties have a policy that if you pay late, a certain number of times, say 3 or 5 times, that they consider that a lease violation and they can move to evict the person. So, but again, other programs, so if people are speaking specifically about Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing Programs, if people are in the Money Follows the Person Bridge Subsidy, they could be charged a late fee for being late. And actually, I'm not sure about Weinberg. Christina or Chelsea, do you guys know? And for community choice homes, do they charge late fees?
Weinberg, no.
Okay.
And I'm like 85% sure community choice homes is a no.
Okay.
But I think Rita's on the call. Yeah, thank you, Rita. No for community choice homes.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. Okay. So one thing to think about is, are there other members in the household? And this is a question that comes up oftentimes during tenant training, because people's lives change and they meet people, or their situations change. They want to know, can someone be added to the lease or to the household? So that is definitely something that should be spelled out in the lease. Typically what happens is that people can usually make changes after they've had 1 year of residence. But again, refer to the lease, because there may be other situations that are different, particularly if it's adult versus child that's going to be added to the household. But that's definitely something that, as a case manager, you should be, when you're doing the housing assessment, you should be asking that, is that a possibility? So that you can get those questions answered for the tenant, and that they can be aware, adding an adult is going to impact the program income limits, because any adult, their income has to be added. Actually, even if a child is receiving like Social Security, or excuse me, SSI, you may need to include that as part of the whole household income. So adults will have to meet criminal background requirements. And for children, there's going to have to be custody documentation. So that means having a court order granting physical custody, or some kind of documentation, if they're going to be having the child live with them more than 50% of the time. And the other important thing for tenants to understand is that they're responsible, as the head of the household, they're responsible for the household members' behavior, and it can impact their ability to continue in the lease. All right. So leases get renewed pretty much every year. Some leases do have a specific clause that will that they go on for 2, or I've even seen 3-year leases. But that's typically in programs like Housing Choice Voucher. But most HUD 811, they're going to have to renew every year. Most of the programs in our in Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing, they have to renew every year. So that means that the tenant will be contacted at least 60 days prior to the lease end. And so they need to respond to that and be aware that that's coming. So that's one of the things, that you want to highlight during tenant training. And they need to be aware that they're going to need to provide more documentation. So it's kind of like a never ending documentation stream. But they're going to typically have to provide updated information on their income, updated information. They may have to provide information about their utility bill, bank statements. Typically, they won't have to, do IDs or birth certificates or social security cards, that they supplied during the original application. But these other things they do need to be able to lay hands on and provide once it's requested. And again, Penny mentioned this, but I always encourage people during tenant training to keep their important documents in one place. And if they can afford it, to buy one of those fireproof safes, to just kind of keep the copy of their birth certificate, their social security card, all of that stuff in. Another thing that people can do sometimes is give a copy to their supports planner or their case manager, or to a trusted family member or friend that they know will be able to produce those documents if they need help getting them. Okay, so this is a true or false question. A landlord can change the locks and place a tenant's personal belongings on the street if they don't move out by the notice to vacate date. And you can respond in the chat. Okay, yeah, most everybody seems to be getting it right. That is false. In Maryland, that is not how it works. And so, there may be other states and other jurisdictions that it does work that way, but in Maryland, people have, renters have protections. Okay. So that kind of leads us into terminating a lease. So, the tenant can terminate the lease in certain specific situations. So when the lease renewal arrives, usually they can choose to give notice that they do not plan to renew. The lease usually will spell out how much notice the tenant is supposed to give. And so that's important because that could impact their ability to get back any security deposit that they may have paid. And if there are any, fees associated with breaking the lease outside of that notice period. And then, the tenant, sometimes if they need to end the lease early due to medical reasons, those are pretty much the reasons that they can without incurring any extra fees. And then the landlord can terminate the lease, but the landlord has certain rules that they have to follow. So they have to provide a notice to vacate. So it has to be a written notice. And it has to be, in Maryland, it has to be provided at least 30 days prior to the requested move out date. And instead of a lease renewal arriving, they may send a letter, the landlord can send a letter saying that they do not intend to renew the lease. And again, they have to give a certain amount of notice for that. So, and a notice to vacate is also could be the start of an eviction process. So if someone is receiving a notice to vacate, that could be the first step. Okay, another true or false question. You can stop paying your rent if the landlord hasn't made necessary repairs. Is that true or false? Yeah. Yes, that is false. So in Maryland, landlords have to go through an eviction process in order to remove someone from their property, and it's a legal process. So again, the first step is the landlord or property manager providing a written notice to vacate. And then the landlord, after the notice to vacate, the landlord or property manager has to file for eviction in district court. And they're usually filing either failure to pay rent, which includes withholding rent for lack of repairs or other issues with the unit. If someone has an issue with that, there's another process that they can do, putting their rent in escrow. But again, that has to go through district court as well. People can't just decide on their own, well, he hasn't fixed, this leak, and so I'm just going to not pay him until that leak is fixed. There's a process that they have to go through in order to, be able to secure or try to pressure the landlord into fixing things that they should be fixing. But they can't just stop. It could result in, again, this filing. Landlords can also file for eviction due to tenant holding over. So that's like if they if the landlord notified the tenant that they were not renewing the lease, and then the lease end date comes and goes and the tenant is still staying there, then that's what tenant holding over is. So they can file, the landlord or the property manager can file with district court based on that. And then finally, breach of lease. So if the tenant violates the terms of the lease, that's why it's so important for your clients to understand that they need to know what is in the lease, because they may be violating things that they don't even really realize that they're violating because it seemed normal to them, or maybe it wasn't an issue in their previous apartment, but it is an issue in this apartment. And a perfect example of that is, if they were able to smoke in a previous apartment, but like in most HUD 11 programs, you can't smoke on the property. So, it could have been fine at their previous place or with their previous landlord, but when their new place, it's not. And they could be accused of violating the terms of the lease, and the landlord could move for eviction. Okay, so the important thing to know about the eviction process is the tenant should receive an official court summons to attend a hearing. And I put this in red because so many times I hear people not going to that hearing. It's really important, if they're at all able to, that they should attend that hearing. And actually they could request a reasonable accommodation from the court around that hearing. But they, really have to be mindful of when they receive these notices, not to just throw it and, I can't deal with it. They hopefully will contact you as their case manager and let you know so that you can help them start addressing the issue. Too many times, unfortunately, people will wait and then, the sheriff's at the door. So the summons may be served in person. It could get mailed, or it could get posted on their door or their mailbox. I've seen that at times. And so, it may not necessarily, come with a lot of fanfare. I have not really heard too many times of evictions being served in person. Usually, like I said, people have received them in the mail or they're posted on somewhere on the property. So a judge will hear the arguments and evidence from both sides at this hearing and decide to either rule in favor of the tenant or the landlord, or they may postpone the hearing to give the parties a chance to resolve the issues that have been raised. And if the judge rules in favor of the landlord can file a court order of eviction, which is also called a warrant of restitution. And within 5 working days, and they can schedule with the sheriff's office to oversee the eviction. So it can happen pretty quickly. Typically, the hearing itself may, the person may get notified about the hearing, and it may be like a month or so before the actual hearing, but the actual eviction, once the landlord has been granted the warrant of restitution, that can happen pretty quickly. It's different times. So it's really important for people to be mindful of when they're receiving these notices and to act on them immediately and not sit and hold it and wait. Which, it can be hard because people have a lot of emotions around eviction. So, but it's something that you should be asking when you're talking with your clients, are there any issues? You haven't had any problems? Or if you get contacted by us during the tenant issue process, it's really important to to jump on that so that any, if they need any legal referrals or, to address the situation, that they can then get that and have time enough to address it before somebody's knocking on their door to put their stuff out in the street. Okay, so the other piece is that the tenant can appeal the eviction within 4 days of the date of judgment and within 10 days of a breach of lease or holding over. And the tenant may have to post a bond to cover the rent while waiting for the circuit court to decide the appeal, which, we're a lot of times dealing with folks who have very limited income. So that can be difficult. If they do, if the eviction is going to proceed on the date of the eviction, the sheriff will come and order the tenant and everyone inside to leave. And then the landlord and property manager or their employees can then remove all of the tenant's property from the unit and put it on the public right of way while the sheriff supervises. Because as you can imagine, this could probably be highly tense situation. So they stay there to kind of manage those interactions. And then the tenant is responsible for moving their property from the public right of way, which, again, could be very difficult. So again, and I can't emphasize this point enough, hopefully that your tenant will inform you, your client will inform you immediately when they receive a notice to vacate or a court summons. And I really, during tenant trainings, I really tried to, part of it is talking with people and trying to figure out if there's any issues or concerns that they're dealing with and like bringing this point up to them. Even if they're not having any issues, just putting it out there and letting people know if there should be, a lease violation or, you should receive a notice to vacate. It's really important that you let your support planner or your case manager know immediately, because it could be the difference between somebody being able to retain their housing and somebody, becoming homeless. The tenant has the right to seek legal counsel. You should not give legal advice. This is not legal advice. It's just informing you about the process. But if the person, if your client is receiving notices to vacate or court summons or warrants of restitution, that's one of my first recommendations, is that they should be referred to legal counsel. And if they're in one of our MPA programs, you can contact me to initiate the tenant issue process. And I'll talk more about that a little further along in the presentation. But we're available for case consultation and assistance with outreach to property managers and landlords to see if we can somehow assist in having the issues resolved. And we have had situations where people have reached out to us and we were able to assist. So I certainly hope, that people will avail themselves of that resource. Sorry, my dog is decided to make herself known. Okay, If all else should fail, and the person is going to lose their housing, the supports planner or case manager should discuss alternative housing options. And, try to best to assist them, so that they are not out on the street. Okay, community rules. So I'm gonna go through this stuff fairly quickly because I know it was discussed in our last session, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. So community rules, again, explain the rules and expectations from the lease in greater details, and they may apply to the tenant, the household members, and guests. So it's really important that your clients understand that community rules, that they're responsible for conveying community rules to their guests and household members. So a big piece of it is communication. How will the landlord and property manager reach the tenant? A lot of times they'll do things by writing, but they may call, they may post things either in the the lobby of the tenant's building or on their unit door. They may send letters, flyers, all of that. And that tenants should be, if they have a phone, they should make sure to keep their phone and if they have email, to keep their email contacts updated with the landlord or property manager. It's very difficult. We've had situations sometimes where people have had real difficulty because they don't have a phone, which, not everybody is able to maintain a phone, but because they don't have a phone and so they've been missing messages or have had difficulty, communicating with landlords. So that is one of the things that we encourage, is to give resources for people so that they can get some kind of telephone or communication so that they can be in communication with the landlord. So the other piece is that as a reasonable accommodation, your client or the tenant can request that their supports planner or their case manager or a family member or even a friend can receive copies of all communication to help them deal with it when things come through. And then again, there's could be communication through the tenant issue process. So as Penny emphasized during her presentation, the relationship between the tenant and the landlord starts from the very beginning and really is very important and can make the difference between their success in tenancy and not being successful in tenancy. And a big piece is dealing with conflict resolution. One of the things we talk about in tenant training is to just, how do you deal with conflict? How do you handle problems with other tenants? Do people know what the grievance and appeals process is? If they need to make complaints or if someone makes a complaint against them. We talk about the fact that if a tenant feels comfortable and they have a personal relationship with a neighbor, like they've been friendly before, they can consider approaching them directly. But sometimes it's also better if the person doesn't know the neighbor or if they think the interaction is hostile or they're just uncomfortable, to go through the property manager or asking for assistance from their supports planner or case manager or some other formal dispute resolution. Because if the person is not comfortable, and if they feel like that would impact their ability to live comfortably in their unit, if they did the direct confrontation with somebody, then we don't want to make people uncomfortable. And there are usually processes in place to address complaints or concerns. Okay. One of the things that happens sometimes, unfortunately, is that there may be problems between the tenant and property staff. And in those situations, we really recommend that the tenant should request assistance from their supports planner or their case manager. And then they can also, again, request assistance through the tenant issue process if they're in the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing Programs. And then tenants always have the right to seek legal representation if situations have risen to the level where they just don't feel comfortable dealing with any of the property staff, or they have concerns about their safety. They should definitely be referred to legal resources to assist them. Ani agrees. Okay, I just am taking a pause to go through the chat, and I see there's a comment. There's some questions I want to go through. All right. I guess this was during the eviction process we were talking about. Etta mentioned, can't you put the rent in escrow? Yes. If the tenant has an issue with, I think the issue was related to if, say, the landlord is not fixing things, then they can go to district court and request to put their rent in escrow. So it is a process that they would need to contact district court, or they could, again, seek legal representation. We'll have some contact information for different legal resources a little bit later on in the presentation to assist them with that process. Okay, someone else asked, if evicted, does the tenant go back on the wait list, or does he or she have to reapply? So that is guided by our, I'm sorry, hold on just one moment. Okay, sorry about that little interruption, dealing with the doggies. If
Marianne,
yes.
this is Penny.
Go ahead.
Is there a legal procedure that they need to go through if the tenant wants to put money in an escrow, or does she need, if she or he or they are the only ones doing it? Because sometimes tenants have gotten together as a community, especially when there's been rodent problems or mice or bugs or something's collapsing, and they've all gotten together to put all their money in escrow versus an individual. And you may not know the answer, but I've thought about that sometimes, because people say, well, I'm just going to put my money aside and I'll have a receipt for it so they know it's there and I can pay it when I need to. But right now I'm holding it back.
Right. I think even if they want to do it, I mean, it would be better if we had an attorney to answer this question, but
yeah,
I know that there's a process for escrow through the district court. So they can go to the court and file. I'm not sure in terms of, if a group of tenants want to get together and do that. I would refer them to a legal resource, Disability Rights Maryland, Maryland Legal Aid,
right.
University of Maryland legal clinic might be able to assist them if there's like larger problems related to, everybody experiencing
Right.
something negative with housing, but they can't just all decide, hey, we're going to stop doing this, and without going through the process, without incurring the possibility that they could be engaged in the eviction process if they all stop paying without going through district court.
Okay. I hear it more in terms of groups of people going through the court versus an individual. So I didn't know if they had to go through the same process, but I agree with you. I think if you have that question, because I have gotten it before from an individual, I refer them back to legal rights, because I don't want to set them up to fail at something and then get into legal problems and then get evicted, so, because I'm definitely not the expert on that, yeah. But it does come up. I thought I should mention that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's all kinds of things that happen.
Yep.
And then finally, Krista mentioned that she works for HCAAC, which I'm sorry, I'm not sure I know. Is that Housing Commission of Anne Arundel County? I'm not sure. But she mentioned that tenants in their program have to reapply for the wait list and go through the process all over again. And that they have emergency vouchers that they can use. Yes. Okay. Yes, it was Housing Commission of Anne Arundel County. Thank you, Krista. Appreciate that. And then for the Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing, we have a tenant selection plan that outlines what the process is if someone is evicted from our program. And there is a period of time before which I believe is 6 months. Maybe Christina or Chelsea can correct me if I'm wrong, before they can reapply to be on the wait list again. Is that right?
So it's not so much about reapplying. It would, I mean, they can apply to be on the wait list, but they have to wait 6 months before they can be offered.
Okay. So
unit.
they remain on the wait list, but they have to.
Well, their case manager has to put them back onto the wait list.
Okay.
So it's a brand new application altogether, but then it's 6 months before they can be offered another unit.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay. All right. So real quickly, I'm just going to go over the smoking policy. Most of community rules address smoking, especially in HUD 811 programs, but many properties may have rules around smoking, regardless of what program you're in. But in Maryland Partnership for Affordable Housing programs, HUD 811, Weinberg, MFP, Bridge Subsidy, the bridge subsidy is kind of an exception, and community choice homes, there's typically no smoking anywhere on the property. And, that applies, again, not only to your client or the tenant, but also to any of their household members or any guests. We have definitely had program participants who have received lease violations because they've had guests that have been smoking, within the property. And that gets reported. People can smell it and that gets reported. The other thing that we really want to emphasize during tenant training is that even if someone has a medical marijuana card, medical marijuana use is prohibited on federally assisted properties per the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act of 1998. So even if somebody has been in a housing situation previously where they were able to smoke medical marijuana, if they're in one of our programs, they are not allowed to, and it can cause them to have a lease violation. Okay, so a big piece that community rules talks about is maintenance of the unit, and that property staff have the right to enter the unit at any time. Usually they'll give some kind of notice. In terms of maintenance emergencies, there's usually a process. So there's usually an emergency number if it's something that can't wait. And it might be a written process for things that are not necessarily something that needs to be addressed immediately. Regular maintenance issues, you know, there might be a number to call, or it might be an online portal that people can leave. And some properties you can just stop by the office and they don't have a problem with taking down that information for you and addressing it. Again, there may be periodic pest control. Typically, if they have something on a regular basis, the tenant gets informed about that during the lease sign up, and then they usually will give some kind of written notice reminder. We talk with people during tenant training about keeping a maintenance log if they're having issues or concerns, particularly if it's something that's recurring frequently. That can be good to kind of have, just note down the date and time that an issue occurred and who you addressed it with, or, you know, did you address it, that kind of thing. Because if it needs to be, like, if you need to put your rent in escrow because something not getting repaired, that can be a good record to use for documenting what those issues were to the court. Again, you know, making sure that smoke detectors are working, knowing whether or not, you know, the person is responsible for replacing light bulbs, or is that something the property does. Typically, if there's, you know, any type of fluorescent light around, that's most likely going to be the property that has to replace that, but not always. So sometimes that kind of thing is spelled out in the community rules. And it's, again, things like HVAC filters, you know, is that something that the tenant is responsible for, or the property? Usually I've seen it's the property, but again, it can be spelled out in the community rules. This is a big one. Guests. You know, tenants are responsible for their guests, and responsible meaning informing their guests of all the rules that they are subject to, like the smoking policy, like quiet hours, things like that. Guests have to follow the community rules. If they don't follow the community rules, it can result in a lease violation for the tenant. And again, you know, knowing about how long guests are allowed to stay, where they are able to park, do they have to register at the property rental office? You know, all of those are things that the tenant should really be aware of. And sometimes people are not. Again, everybody comes from different backgrounds. So maybe somebody has leased in a similar place before, and so they're aware of these type of rules. And maybe this is the first time the person is leasing or renting, and this is all brand new to them. So it's really important to bring up during tenant training and the impact that guest behavior can have on their tenancy. Okay. Community rules also discusses things like, you know, how to dispose of trash, you know, where do they put recycling? Again, you know, do they have to take it out to the dumpster, or is there a specific room for it? All of that is important because all of these things can result in lease violations. So that's why we bring up even the little minute issues. Is your tenant aware of what the quiet hours and the noise policy is? You know, that is something that people either are frequently complaining about or are receiving lease violations about, you know, that they're not maintaining quiet hours and that they're disturbing their neighbors, and they're getting multiple complaints and can lead to them, again, getting a lease violation. What is the firearms policy? More and more that may be something that is in, I've actually not seen that in the community rules, but I imagine given you know, the state of our country right now, that might be something that more properties put into place, that they have a specific rules around firearms and having them on the property and where they need to be stored and things like that. So it's always good to just be aware. The pet policy. Most places do have a set pet policy, and may require, if the person wants to keep a pet, may require that they pay a pet deposit and then a monthly pet fee. And of course, there's an exception for assistance or support animals. And then they may have policies around supervision of children and how you move in and out. One time we were contacted through the tenant issue process because someone was moving in, but they hadn't scheduled it with the office. And, so it didn't result in a lease violation, but it was a concern because that particular property had very specific times, and they did, they put certain things in the elevator to keep the walls from being damaged when people were moving in and out. And so having somebody try to move in without having been scheduled made things difficult for other tenants. So those are the kind of things that community rules can spell out. And again, use of common areas. This is all pretty straightforward. Mailboxes, what's the rules around receiving packages? What are the parking rules? Again, all of the things on this list we're aware of because they've been brought up to us before. People have had issues with the mailbox. People have had issues with packages being sent back because they hadn't made appropriate arrangements with how to get them into a building that had restricted access. We had somebody who received a lease violation because they had their aide, they had given their aide like a bypass to get into a parking space, and they hadn't gone through it in the appropriate way, and it ended up causing them to get a lease violation. So, it's important to go over these things, and it can be tailored to your client. If your client doesn't have a car, maybe parking rules are not as important, or if they don't have people who are visiting them, maybe you don't emphasize the guest policy as much. But it's one of those things where just being aware that these are some things that might come up that you wouldn't necessarily think, and just kind of going over it with people, because the goal again is to keep them housed. Rules around storing flammable materials, their storage. Is there a dress code? We did receive communication from the property about somebody going to the corporate office and they were in their pajamas, or so it's just things that you wouldn't necessarily think, but depending on which community you're in, it may be something that's important to them, and should be communicated to the tenant. Again, Penny kind of touched on this. So the only thing I'll say about keeping the unit clean is when we do tenant trainings, I do, just touch on this lightly, but emphasizing that hopefully the person is able to clear a path, keep a clear path to get into the unit, because many of the people that we're dealing with have medical issues and concerns, and may have emergency personnel coming into their apartment. So it's important that I emphasize the importance of making sure that things are clear so that they can get to them wherever they are. Ani agrees. Is there a bed bug policy? Sometimes there's a bed bug policy that is separate from pest control policy. So it's important to know what that is, and what the steps are around it. Sometimes they can be quite complicated. So it's important to know what the steps can be around that. I always like to emphasize during tenant training that, there can be an annual unit inspection. And so, that they may note how clean your apartment is. And again, depending on what the issues are happening, it could result in a lease violation. People can hopefully get help with cleaning if they have difficulty doing it on their own. You know, if they're in one of our home and community-based services programs, then they may have access to a personal care assistant that can help with some light cleaning. There may be housekeeping services that could assist them. Some counties in Maryland have hoarding task force groups that work to help people address any hoarding issues that may come up, or collecting. I know we're not supposed to call it hoarding anymore. We just had a training about that, and I can't remember what the new term is. But you know, just trying to be sensitive when you're going over this, and kind of sensitive but matter of fact about some of these issues that may come up. Because if the person is dealing with a situation where maybe they're collecting items and kind of keeping things, you know, that can be sensitive to address with them. And hopefully, you know, when you're working with the person, oftentimes when we're doing tenant training, we don't know, you know, the person beyond, you know, a few set of facts. But if you're doing tenant training with your client, hopefully you know and can find the best way to address any issues with them. Okay, so again, this is a question we'll just ask you to answer in the chat. Does anybody know what temperature BGE recommends that thermostats be set to in the summer? Wow. So people are saying 70 or 71 or 72. So I'm talking about the air conditioning. Yeah, 78. Yeah, so some people are aware of that. Yes, when you do any type of training about energy assistance programs, which sometimes certain programs require you to do in order to get assistance to pay for them, BGE talks about that they recommend setting the thermostat to 78 in the summer so that your air conditioning doesn't go too much below that. Okay. So again, community rules also can talk about the appliances. You know, we just talked about the thermostat. Penny talked about the dishwasher. There may be garbage disposal rules. And this can actually, again, if the person has a lot of experience renting or using a garbage disposal, you know, then it may not be an issue, but some people are not aware of things that cannot go in there, and it can actually cause them to an extra expense, because if they put something in a garbage disposal that's not supposed to be in there and it breaks, the property could potentially hold them liable for that. At the very least, they're not going to be able to use it for a period of time. So, you know, it's good to go over some of these issues because people might not have ever thought about it before. Okay, dealing with damage to the unit. So, you know, the tenant could be responsible, and it could impact their security deposit or their ability to get their security deposit back if they're ending up moving out or changing units at the end of their lease. And so some examples, and these were all examples that unfortunately that tenants in our programs have experienced. Damage to the oven from cleaning, like using the wrong cleaning products. Damage to the unit door for emergency responders. We've had people who were cooking and kind of left things on the stove and it started smoking, and another tenant in the building realized there was smoke and called 911, and then the fire, you know, and rescue personnel came and broke down the door. And so, luckily the unit wasn't on fire yet. It was just a smoking pot. But now that tenant was responsible for paying for that door, and those doors are expensive. Again, damage to walls and floors that may come from wheelchairs. There may be some reasonable accommodations that can be requested to assist with that. Listing of repair costs. Some properties do provide that to people. Things that are the landlord or the owner's responsibility might be flooding from other apartments, or, if there's storm damage, fire, if it's not something that's caused by the tenant, but maybe it was another tenant, or maybe it was some other issue that caused that. And then if the property staff damages the unit when performing maintenance. Okay, so this is the tenant issue process that I mentioned before. Basically, we encourage the property manager to develop, as well as the tenant, to develop relationship with each other so that they are able to communicate easily. And so the first step in the process is that if there's an issue with a potential lease violation, or just really any issue, that hopefully the property manager or the landlord will contact the tenant directly to try to resolve the issue. If that fails to resolve the issue, then the property manager next contact would be to the case manager or the supports planner. If for some reason the property manager, let me back up. So hopefully the property manager or the landlord is able to reach the case manager, and then the case manager can assist the tenant to resolve the issue, discuss the severity of the violation, assist with getting any additional services or resources to address the situation, and then they can update the property manager that how it's being handled or resolved. And they can also reach out to us, to MPOD, to me, if they need some case consultation or suggestions on how to deal with something, or if it's kind of a novel situation and they're really not sure. If for some reason the property manager can't reach the case manager, then they can reach out to me. Oftentimes, they might reach out to Christina or Chelsea, since they have experience with them in terms of the whole leasing up process and onboarding with the HUD 811 program. They may reach out to Penny if they've met Penny before. So, and in any case, if they reach out to me, or if they reach out to our program, then we will then in turn try to reach out to the case manager and see if they are aware of the situation, and just to offer any assistance in resolving the situation if we can. If for some reason they can't reach me, they'll reach Christina, and then she'll reach me. So we just have this process laid out so that people are aware that, there is assistance available to address concerns, and that, our goal, as always, is to try to help the tenant to maintain their tenancy and be successful, and not have any lease violations. That's not always possible, but we do try to set all of these things up in so that we can meet that goal. Oh, I wanted to go to the chat for a minute because someone was asking in the chat related to the poll question about what temperature. Let's see. Etta asked, can't 78 degrees be too hot, and it could cause issues, especially for people with medical needs? Yes, that's true. What we emphasize during tenant training is that, obviously the person is going to want to set the temperature so that they're comfortable. But that it will impact how much their bill is. And we also talk about applying for various programs like Maryland Energy Assistance Program and accessing the fuel fund to help people pay for any utility overages that they have, because the utility is going to be over the utility allowance most likely, especially if they need to keep things warmer in their house during the winter or cooler in their house during the summer. So we just emphasize, yes, these are the ideal temperatures according to BGE, but that obviously each person is individual and they need to set the temperature in their home so that they're comfortable, but just being aware of the impact that it can have on their bill.
I think Marianne, this Penny, I emphasize that as well, because it's kind of cause and effect. Just
Right.
putting it up to a number is going to impact your bill. And maybe you need to see that and then be able to modify, or not even having a guest do that as well. Because sometimes people come in, oh, it's too hot in here. And they push the air up. And just being aware of that and knowing that that's something they need to keep an eye on.
Yes.
It's not that they're being careless, it's just how impactful it is when you're doing it yourself versus if you're in a program and you're moving out for the very first time. The program had control of that, or someone that owned the house, or whatever, or the hospital or the nursing home. And now it's up to you. So it really is important to kind of acknowledge that might be an issue,
Right. Thanks, Benny. That's very good. Okay, we're winding down because I'm aware that it is 1 minute left. All right. So these are some of the resources that we were talking about before with the websites attached. These are the legal resources that we were mentioning. So, again, you'll get a copy of this presentation, so you'll get a chance to have all of these. And again, this is our contact information. If you have any questions or, if we can help, or you need help with the tenant issue process or questions about this presentation, please feel free to reach out. Email is the best way to reach Lisa and I, and Penny has her email and her phone number available.
Right.
There.
Texting me is a good idea as well. So I can answer them.
All right. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they wanted to comment on? Oh. All right. Well, thank you all for taking the time to participate today. Our next series will be next Thursday, again, between 10 and 12. I can't remember who's presenting, but, hopefully you're already registered. I believe the registrations went out for that already.
Is it going to be unreasonable accommodations, Christina or Chelsea? Is it?
No,
I think that's the last one.
that's the last one.
Okay. That's Diane and Lucy.
I think it's Renita and Miss Lopez. That's
Okay.
presenting next
Okay.
week.
Okay.
Emergency preparedness is the topic.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. All right. So
Okay.
hopefully
Thanks, Lisa.
see you all then.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
All right.
All
Take
right.
care.
Bye. Bye.